This video is going to be brief about the process of speciation. A species, and this is the biological species concept, there are actually several different definitions of species. But according to the biological species concept, a species is a group of organisms that can breed together, which means they can mate together, and they can produce viable offspring from that mating. And so speciation is going to be the process by which a population becomes a new species. So here we've been talking about evolution. Now we're just going to say, okay, how do things go from maybe one species to two different species? So reproductive isolation is going to be where organisms that are members of two different species are reproductively isolated from each other. That means they cannot mate and or they cannot produce viable offspring. And this occurs because of various reproductive barriers that exist between the different groups of individuals. Okay, so pre-zygotic barriers are barriers that are going to exist before a zygote happens between two different organisms. So these are things that prevent organisms from mating. The first type of isolation you can have is geographic isolation. This type of isolation occurs when two different groups of organisms are separated physically. One is on one side of the canyon, the other is on the other side of the canyon. One is in America, the other's in Europe. And if you can't get to each other, you are geographically isolated. Another is behavioral isolation. This will also prevent different organisms from mating. Let's say that I attract a mate by waving my, my right hand, or that would be my left hand. I'm waving my left hand, but someone else over here attracts by waving their left hand, and for whatever reason, that behavior is a miscommunication, and therefore these two organisms don't reproduce. And so that is a barrier, that is a reproductive barrier, behavioral isolation. They are not attracted to each other. Then there is temporal isolation. Temporal has to do with time and seasons. Maybe somebody breeds, as you hear about mating seasons. Maybe one organism has a mating season during the spring and the other one has a mating season during the fall. So even if they live in the same place and they're attracted to each other, if it is not time to mate respectively, they still will not mate. So that is temporal isolation. There is also, say you do live in the same place and you mate at the same time and you're attracted to each other, there can also be mechanical isolation. Which basically means that the two parts of the organisms required to mate do not fit together. And so even if they do live in the same place and they mate at the same time and they're attracted to each other, their bodies cannot physically allow them to go through the process of mating and their anatomies. And last but not least, there is gametic isolation. And in this case, the organisms can go through the act of mating, and yet when sperm, so we talk about gametes here, when sperm and egg meet, the enzymes that the sperm needs to digest the outer coating of the egg so that it can fertilize the egg, they don't match. And we said that enzymes are like a lock and key. They have that fit. So even if they are in the same place and they mate at the same time and they're attracted to each other, and even if they can go through the physical act of mating, if their gametes can't actually fuse to form a zygote, you will not be able to reproduce. There are some instances where organisms who are different species can create offspring or can create a zygote. And so we're going to talk just a tidbit about this. The first one and sort of most common one that's sort of understood is called hybrid infertility. Which you can also sort of think of as sterility. So basically what this is saying is that a hybrid is sterile. This is sort of like a mule is sterile, and so even though the organisms can create the child itself cannot reproduce. And so those two species, I believe it's a horse and a donkey, create a mule. Those two species are still separate species because even though they can create a child, that child is not viable offspring because it is sterile and cannot create its own children. And then the last is this hybrid inviability. And hybrid inviability is basically where you can create a zygote, but that child might not develop into a mature individual that might be old enough to breed, or it does not basically live very long.